I'm really excited to be here and tell you a little bit about my research, but also some of the things that we can do, each of us as leaders in each of our different communities and in institutions that we work in, whether that be for research or health or other sorts of things, practitioner or not. So we're in this space, so it should come as no surprise to any of us that our world is rapidly changing, rendering many organisms at risk of extinction from a variety of different threats, such as many that you've heard across the past few days and also even today, including increasing temperatures, increasing levels of CO2, leading to devastating events such as floods, fires, and even as we've seen over the past few years, increasing amounts and levels of disease. Now, of course, this means that never has it been more important for us to understand the ways that organisms, including ourselves, can adapt or respond to these changes in our environment. And not only that, never has it been more important to actually understand that not all communities are going to respond the same way or have the capacity to even respond to some of these changes. And not all places and spaces and people are going to be as affected as with climate change. So for today's outline, I'm going to run through just a brief kind of level of current and projected impacts of climate change on biodiversity loss to kind of arm you with, I think, the kind of information that you can use when you're talking to people about this current crisis. Next, I'm going to give you just a brief introduction to some of my research. I'm going to run through some of the things that we study in 4 different systems, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit of a call of action of what we can do to alleviate this crisis. So this figure shows the natural vegetation that's left on Earth, not impacted or degraded by a variety of different sorts of threats. And so if I showed you before to now, then it would be like, oh man, this sucks. But if we take the positive from it, right, there's still some green natural vegetation left on Earth. However, with the degradation levels that we can see in brown, we know that as early as 2050, global biodiversity loss will approach 10 to 20% for some organismal groups. And sometimes when I give this statistic to my students, they'll be like, you know what, Dr. Gordon, 20% isn't that bad. we can live through that. However, what I have to remind them is that the loss that we're going to experience are some core organisms or core species that are going to further emit a lot of stress on our global human food security, our human economic and cultural well-being, and further harm human health. But the loss, again, is not going to be felt the same everywhere else. So for example, the global south, particularly regions like the Caribbean and South America, are on the front lines of the biodiversity climate crisis and biodiversity climate crisis. Because these regions are crucial regions for global biodiversity. That means that they have a lot of species that are only placed in these spaces, which means they're highly vulnerable to climate-related impacts. So as we can see on this pie chart that you see on the other side, climate change, so direct effects of climate change on biodiversity actually takes up a really large chunk, so 12.5% in these regions. Now if we look at indirect effects of climate change on things like that big purplish, whatever reddish level, which is land degradation and loss, we can see that climate change, if we actually input the indirect as well as direct effects of climate change, would take up a much bigger piece of the puzzle. If you look at this graph on this side, it's showing you the Living Planet Index, which is made up of all of the populations that we have been monitoring in this group from between the years 1970 and 2016. And we can see that in these regions, of the populations that we've monitoring, we're seeing a decline of around 94% of these populations. That doesn't mean that the species are gone. It just means that as the species are spread in different populations in regions that we're monitoring, that we're losing a lot of those species. So that's really, really unfortunate. We can shift that and actually look at someplace else, like North America. And we can see here the climate change effect, again, is really strong, especially if you take the indirect as well as direct levels. And we also see a decline in the populations that we are monitoring, but of course that decline is much less. Now, we can think about the fact that are these trends, right? We're seeing all of these changes, and we're seeing trends, population trends for not only populations, but also species, so biodiversity, as well as things such as warming or increasing CO2 levels. And I always get asked a question, are these trends that we're predicting into the future overestimated? And the answer is no, okay? So over the past few years, we've had a few papers published that have actually shown that our past climate models that have predicted what is happening today in terms of biodiversity loss as well as warming have been overwhelmingly accurate. So this picture is showing you one of those past climate models, and this is of temperature changes from 1970 all the way up to the year 2000. Around 2004 was when this was published, highlighting what we would have expected the temperature to be around now, around 2024. And as you can see, that the projected amount in black actually matches quite well with the observed values that we see in red. The same thing is happening for biodiversity. Our projected trends that we can see in gray are going to be really, really horrible by the year 2100, okay? So that's really, really horrible. But there are ways that we can buck the trend. It's not all doom and gloom. We know that organisms can adapt. They can change. We know that we have seen it in ourselves that we can adapt to different changes in our environment. But what we need is time. We need strategies and solutions that are going to come in and buy each of us time so that nature can take over and right itself. And the way that we can buy ourselves time is what many other people have mentioned, including people on this platform this morning, right? We need conservation strategies and policies that are going to be able to come in. And with that, you can see that we can hit that green bar, which is not bad. Okay? If we want to hit that yellow, where we're actually reversing the trend, then we have to implement sustainability measures. That means, of course, we need things like clean energy, we need resources that are going to be global, but what we also need is a stronger connection between humans, human communities, and the conservation strategies that we are trying to implement. We need humans to understand that their future and their security is linked to these biodiversity and climate crises. So how can scientists bend the curve? Well, there's a variety of different things we can do, right? We can do long-term bioset monitoring. That's exactly what we need, to continue monitoring these populations, to continue monitoring these species, to continue looking at what are the solutions that we have been doing so far and are they working. We, of course, need global participation. This is the thing that I think everyone's going to keep narrowing home, especially in this space. Here, we can register it. We can take it in, and we believe it. But there are many places that we work that do not believe this. They believe that the answers are formed in certain places. They believe the answers are formed in certain institutions and by certain people, okay? We need to change that thinking. Of course, we need sustainable strategies that are going to highlight human health linked to these biodiversity challenges. We need advanced incorporation of genomic and statistical modeling tools, including AI learning, machine learning analyses, and dynamic modeling. And that's what a lot of the larger grants that I'm leading or being a part of now, the multi-million-dollar grants, are doing this. It's bringing in these new technologies. And then, of course, we need more data on what makes certain individuals, certain populations, certain communities, certain ecosystems more vulnerable to climate change than others. So our group studies this. We study the way that organisms across the globe actually respond to climate changes in their environment. We do so over a variety of different systems and places that we work on. And our whole idea is we focus on the way that intraspecific diversity, and that is diversity within species, can actually be a solution that can help mitigate the climate crisis. And what this means, for example, is that if something comes through and happens in an environment that, for instance, wipes out smaller individuals of a population, if they have enough genetic variation and the larger ones survive, then they can, of course, in next generations bring out that variation that we may have missed, rather than if there's only one form, one type of them. And so we really try to focus on that. And again, we work with diverse systems across diverse topics, and we include diverse perspectives because we need people from different walks of life to have these conversations and make these changes. And I actually want to highlight that we kind of put our money where our mouth is. So within my research group that makes up a lot of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today, we come from many different nationalities, different religions, different everything if you really think about it. You know, we are the UN of the groups at Cornell. And they also include my two cheapest research assistants, which are the ones that I made myself. Okay, so now I want to tell you about 4 different systems that I work in. The first is this, oops, let me move it so maybe the video will get going. The first is this aposematic wood tiger moth. Now it's found across the globe, as you can see there, right? So it's everywhere. It's aposematic. That means that it highlights its toxicity by releasing chemicals and showing bright colorations to tell this bird, don't eat me. When the bird grabs the wood tiger moth, it's going to release toxins called pyrazines from its neck gland and also from its anal gland for insect predators. The bird's going to taste that pyrazine, and then it's going to throw it away because it really doesn't like it. And so we study why do you have different forms of this moth when we want the bird to understand, right, that like, we don't want to eat you. But not only that, these moths that play a large role in, of course, many ecosystem functions are vulnerable. Their numbers are declining all around the globe. And that's because their life history, they run through one generation every year. And part of their life history is that as caterpillars, in the winter, they will bury down into the snow cover. And they will actually emerge in the spring to continue eating before they become pupa. But as the globe warms, it's changing snow cover. And a lot of these Lepidoptera don't have the same thing anymore. And so we're studying how that's going to actually relate to them as they move on. Oops. Okay, so I also work in Madagascar, and one of the species that we're studying, my grad student Udita is holding, which is a chameleon. And so we're looking at how things that as humans expand into these natural vegetation areas, and we're seeing it a lot in Madagascar. How are organisms able to now withstand to the increased pollution in their levels, but also increased artificial light at night, which is changing sleep patterns. It's changing like activity patterns of nocturnal animals as now we have all of this light at night. And so we're studying how to implement conservation strategies for these reptiles that are from Madagascar, right? Some of the species are only found in Madagascar. How to implement strategies when certain human communities around them, for instance, see them as a positive omen and others see them as a negative omen. So if we're implementing a certain strategy that's in a particular community, but then they don't really like chameleons, how do we integrate that so that it is a sustainable change that can happen? We also work in USA, and we work with the monarchs, which are indicators of ecosystem health. So in your environments, if monarchs are there, if you see a lot of them, that means you have a pretty healthy environment. If they're supposed to be there and they're not, then something is wrong. Monarchs are pollinators, so they're extremely important, right? And so we study their population dynamics under things such as increasing urbanization. An interesting thing also is that monarchs, some populations will migrate from North America down to Mexico and then back up again across multiple generations. And it's something that is extremely well studied. But something that we've started doing, because we're noticing this rapid decline of insect populations, is we're starting to build things like community gardens, right? All of those strategies that you see. However, we are very strategic in where we build these gardens, and I don't mean in a good way. A lot of these gardens are being built in areas that are not affiliated by issues such as redlining, right? We're building them in white and richer areas. I lived in St. Louis before, and that's where I did a lot of my work. And we have something there called the Del Mar Divide, which is basically a leftover from the historical things of representation and segregation, of redlining and segregation in the US. So basically above Del Mar, which you can see here, right? Above Del Mar, we have a lot of black and brown people, and below Del Mar, that street, we have white communities. A lot of the community gardens to help monarch populations are in the whiter areas. But when a monarch is migrating, it's not gonna be like, let me bypass these black and brown areas and move into the white one. No, it's gonna be going through it. If we don't make sure that there are people that look at this perspective and say, no, that's wrong, it needs to change, then it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter, and this is actually repeated not only in St. Louis, but in many parts of America and the globe. We also, of course, work with communities, so this is one of my graduate students, Hannah, working with some elderly communities in Ithaca. Okay, so I also work in Trinidad, and I work with the Trinidadian guppies. Trinidadian guppies are also global, so they're found everywhere except Antarctica, and they've been introduced around the globe for a variety of reasons that I'll tell you about later, but they've managed to withstand and thrive in even extreme environments, which is fantastic. We find them in hot springs, we find them in ultra-polluted, oil-polluted lakes, sulfur-polluted areas, you know, like, they're actually an example that we use to say, what are characteristics that allow organisms to spread, that allow them to withstand certain extreme environments, because these are the characteristics that we want to make sure we have in all of our other vulnerable populations. We do know, however, that numbers in Trinidad, which is where they're from, are declining over time. They have the name the millions fish. Now you go out and they're not so much millions anymore, right? So we're also studying why that is. So guppies are special for a lot of reasons. But again, I do a lot of work in Trinidad. You know, we also work in Brazil. We're starting to move into Jamaica as well. And so Trinidad is known for its carnival, as you can see here. I used to play mass as a kid, and so like it's an important thing for me. They're known for their doubles. I know y'all saw that. I heard someone on my bus talking about that there was a place close to my hotel that actually has doubles. So I'm like, yes, because we don't have it in Ithaca, and my cooking of them sucks. They're also known for their beautiful beaches. I'm from Jamaica. My claim to fame is that, you know, I went to the same high school as Usain Bolt. That's as close as I'm ever gonna get to being a celebrity. Although I do think Jamaican beaches are prettier, I always say that, but I do love Trinidadian beaches. But something that people don't also know about Trinidad is that it's a beautiful example to do environmental research, especially when you're talking about freshwater biology. And that's because their rivers run in parallel to the northern and southern slope of their northern range mountains. So we can do a lot of field experiments, we can do a lot of monitoring that gives us kind of like replicates across the island to study some of the effects of climate change, and not only that, urbanization, because you have decreasing levels of urbanization as you get closer down. Okay. Oh, here we go. So this is just showing you something else that we can do with these fish, is that we can bring them into the lab from the wild, which you can see from my students doing it. We can also bring them into semi-natural environments. And so for one thing, my group and I, we've built these artificial streams where we can then manipulate the food web. We build the food web just as we would see it in Trinidad. And then we can do things like removing different components, putting in organisms that we know genetically adapted to certain different types of things. We can put them under stuff like heat waves, and then we can manipulate all sorts of facets of not only the organisms within the community or the ecosystem, but also the external factors, and then see what's going to happen, and then put that into our projection models for the future. So lots of really cool things that we can do. Okay, so our lab uses a lot of different organisms basically to show you the strength of intraspecific diversity in mitigating climate change solution and in leading to climate change solutions. And that by expanding the reach that we are doing, if you're working, in certain things in your whatever field you're in, you can learn to step back and be like, how can I expand this a little bit further? How can I collaborate with people from different parts of life or different disciplines in order to reach at these bigger picture questions, which is what we're going to need to lead to solutions. So finally, I'm going to end out with just talking a little bit about where can we go next. We already know a lot about different solutions. We have enough data. I always say we have enough data. We can stop now for a little bit, right, and focus on other things. But just like in nature, the importance of intraspecific diversity, we need intraspecific diversity in human populations within each of our workspaces, and that's what I want to argue for now. So again, global issues are going to need global participation, and it doesn't just mean having them around, like somebody said, right? We don't need the helicopter science and the helicopter research thing going on. It's having them participate, be involved in the ideas, the dissemination of research, and everything like that. And I want to kind of use a game to illustrate this. So just shout out the answer. What color are our eyes? We hear like turquoise, heard blue, green, right? Everyone's going to see this differently. People are going to see it differently because we all want to believe that science and scientific research is objective, but I'm here today to tell you, and now you're armed with some stuff, to tell you that it is not, right? That our backgrounds and our experiences all go into the different ideas that we might want to study or the perspectives that we're going to bring to our solutions and our research. Are these two circles, the orange circles, the same color? Same or different? Size. Are they the same size? Someone said same? No, yeah. They actually are the same size. But again, our perspective matters. When we're looking at that little orange circle that's surrounded by the bigger blue ones and we're like, nah, you're small, right? Because it's just our perspective. And if we shift our perspective to understand that that exists, if I told you before this is something that exists, everyone would say the same. They're probably same. I don't see it, but I know they're the same, right? Because our perspective, even if we can't see it ourselves, we understand that it matters. Okay, so how can we lead change? Many academics, many people across each of our disciplines aren't aware that we often have biases that lead us to exclude diverse teams and diverse structures and perspectives in the work that we do. How can you change this? Look around you. If you're doing a study in human health and you understand that the participants in your study come from one homogeneous group, then change it or question whether or not your results are something that actually can be generalizable. If you're looking at wing dynamics, then step outside that box and actually see who cares if I save this organism? Who cares if I study that protein in this whatever? Step outside of it and try to look at the bigger picture perspectives that might come by inviting other people into the work that you do and the spaces that you occupy. So in conclusion, wow, I keep going the wrong way. In conclusion, climate change is going to affect us all. Biodiversity loss is going to affect us all. Species interactions across food webs and ecosystems means that we cannot just focus our conservation strategies and our sustainability strategies on one piece of the puzzle. At some point, there has to be leaders amongst us that are going to try and look at the big piece of that puzzle. We highlight the importance of diversity, intraspecific diversity in nature, and just like that, we need to increase participation in the different things that we're doing when we think about climate change and biodiversity research. And just as I showed you with little small fish or a small reptile or a butterfly, that they can actually be powerful when it comes to exerting ecosystem change on structure and function, then so can we. We have the power within each of us to make a change and make a difference. I end every single one of my talks with these pictures because it shows me where I stand today, and that I'm coming from the backs, like standing on the backs of giants that have led to me being able to talk in a lot of these places, and many times very white spaces that do not want me to be here and do not want me to be speaking to them and giving them these different perspectives. And I understand from where my strength lies, and I know that I don't want to go back there, right? That they've already done the work and we're bringing it forward. And so I make sure that I highlight it in every time. Like I said, each of us has the power to be leaders in whatever it is that we're doing, whether you're a student or whether you're a CEO of your own company or corporation, because this climate change crisis and biodiversity crisis is each of our fights. So let's get it. And I thank you all for listening.